what was it for you at your start or beginning? What interested you the most? What you have been working on? We had a few conversations about, the process of your work, that you go in, you have something you want to work on, and then it forms while you are doing it. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about how this whole thing started for you and
I'll tell
the
you,
first steps you made?
For instance, when I ended up at Chouinard, which was an art school, which is now Cal Arts. And we're talking like 1960 or 67, 68, somewhere around then. And I started going to this art school, and everybody at the time, Terrell and Irwin and all these guys were starting to do light and space type stuff, and there was a lot of plastic going on. Dwayne Valentine was casting these gigantic wedges and resin, and all these people were in that stuff. And I came up with this bright idea to make these plexiglass paintings. And I wanted to make them 6 by 6 feet. So I started a plexiglass frame company so I could afford to buy the plastic. And I bought saws from the school because the school was upgrading to impress the people from Disney, which were going to buy it. And so I bought the saws. I rented a big loft, moved them into there. I hired a couple of talented students to make frames so I could go out and hustle frames at openings of it. So I was hanging around the art world. Anyway, I made these 6 by 6 foot plexiglass paintings that were sprayed with lacquer for a color, and the front sheet was transparent. And I made distortions in the plastic so that light passing through would make light and shadow images, and you couldn't tell where the images were coming from. And by a fluke thing, I won the Young Talent Award from the County Museum, and I think it was 1968 or 69. And I got called into school because they reprimanded me. He said, "You won the Young Talent Award. You're not allowed to do that. You're a student." I said, "Well, I did." And they said, "I understand that you're not bringing your art into school for the professors to see it. You tell them if they want to see your art, they have to come to your studio." I said, "Yeah, it's too big to bring them." And they said, "You can't do that." And then they said I was hiring students to help make frames. And anyway, they said, "You can't." Anyway, so I quit school. And what was kind of fascinating was I won that thing making these plexiglass paintings. It worked off of light and stuff. And immediately I had this feeling that I didn't want to do that because there seemed to be a general movement of people interested in that. And when I was at Chouinard back in those days, see, the art world used to be a lot different. They had critics that really analyzed what people were doing and kind of defined what was up. And for some weird reason, around that time, they had the attitude that painting and sculpture was dead, that you couldn't make it because everything had been done. And they were pushing stuff like performance art, photography, and, stuff like that, which I couldn't relate to at all. And so one of the reasons I made the plexiglass paintings, it was like making paintings without making paintings. And what happened was, by a fluke set of circumstances, there was a fire in Malibu. And I went up to Malibu to steal fruit with this buddy of mine out of an orchard. And when I was standing in the orchard, I looked around and all these eucalyptus trees that surrounded had been burned. And so the tree branches were burned, and so they looked like charcoal hand-drawn lines against the sky. And I thought, that's interesting. That looks like a hand-drawn line that I didn't produce. So I broke a bunch of branches off and brought them back to the studio, and I ended up making tree branch paintings because I felt, okay, I'm making paintings without making paintings. And fortunate for me, there was this very influential curator from Europe came through L.A. and he saw these stick paintings and wanted me to be in Documenta 5, which was a big deal in Kassel, Germany. It only happens every 5 years, and it's a huge international show, and they put me in this show. And actually, Klaus Oldenburg was a featured artist that year of of that show, and he had the Art Forum did a huge spread on him, gave him the cover, and they asked him if anything impressed them at Documenta, and he said two things stood out. Richard Serra brought these 8 by 8 foot sheets of steel into a room and shoved them in the corners, and this kid Chuck Arnoldi made these big tree branch paintings, and so that created a lot of interest.
And I do also remember, the Documenta, it's a art show, how we call it in Germany. And in the late, 60s, early 70s, they were revolutionary.
Yes.
People who, as you explained, walked in there and they expected landscape painting on the wall or kind of a portrait,
right,
were faced with a cow giving birth, in the entrance. That was, again, actionism. And Harald Szeemann, we talked about Harald Szeemann, who is, or unfortunately was, one of the biggest curators of
he was
that
great.
time. Yeah. And he brought all these people together. He was Swiss and was running a museum in Switzerland. They threw him out because he had Joseph Beuys smearing fat against the walls, and the museum nearly got destroyed in this exhibition. But I think he was also responsible for American artists like you to be exposed in Europe, and for this first inter-exchange in the early 70s, which was, not done before. European artists showed in Europe, American artists showed in America. And so have you been going to Documenta Kassel Germany, or have you been? I
had never been. I went, I couldn't even believe it. I mean, there must have been 180 artists in the show.
Yeah.
I met Joseph Beuys and stuff. And the thing, see, was that a curator like that, he was paying attention to the art. He was wondering, does this art speak to me? You didn't have to be a famous artist. You didn't have to be represented by a certain gallery. He was looking at the art itself. And I think that's a major change between back then and today. They're not looking at the art to decide if it's showable. In fact, there isn't really anything like criticism anymore. There are people that review art shows, but they don't, they're not looking at the art and if it has
a relevance.
Relevance, and is it somehow influenced by history? Because even though the most radical people, guys like Pollock, they were responding to art history.
Exactly.
And
so we can talk about this, is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? But it is what it is.